I'm Lauren Mitchell, 36 years old, and I never thought I'd hear my own mother tell me that my presence would ruin the family's plans. My father was beside her, his voice flat as he added that I had changed and no longer fit in. In that instant, it wasn't just rejection. It was the confirmation that I had been reduced to nothing more than the person who signed the checks. They had drawn a line, and my children and I were left on the outside of it. The sting of that moment never really leaves you, especially when it comes from the very people who are supposed to protect your place at the table. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever felt like family treated you as less than one of their own. I was born and raised in a small Midwestern town where family meant long Sunday dinners, front porch conversations, and helping each other without hesitation. My parents taught us about community, generosity, and loyalty, or at least that's what I believed. I carried those lessons into adulthood, especially after I became a single mother. Grace and Ethan were my world, and every choice I made was with their future in mind. I built a consulting career from the ground up, one that allowed us stability and small luxuries I never had growing up. I thought success would make my parents proud, that it would prove I had done something right. But as the years passed, I noticed the shifts. When Megan struggled financially, my parents stepped in with gentle requests that I help out just this once. It was always framed as family supporting family, and I obliged. My sister and her husband Daniel were constantly painted as hardworking but unlucky, deserving of another chance, while my efforts were rarely mentioned. I told myself it didn't matter that my children would see generosity as a strength. What I didn't see then was how quickly generosity can turn into expectation, and how expectation can turn into entitlement. Last year at one of those familiar Sunday dinners, my mother brought up her lifelong dream of taking the family to Europe. She described cobblestone streets, vineyards at sunset, and children eating gelato on warm afternoons. Megan and Daniel nodded along, talking about how impossible it felt with their finances stretched thin. My father leaned back in his chair and glanced at me in that quiet way he always did when money was involved. My mother said softly, "Lauren, you're in a good place right now with work. Maybe you could help cover the costs. It would mean everything to us." And without hesitation, I agreed. I wired the money within the week, picturing Grace and Ethan marveling at old cathedrals, holding hands while we explored together. I saw us taking photos on balconies, sharing meals in tucked-away cafes, and finally living out one of those perfect family dreams my parents always talked about. For months, I imagined us there building memories that would belong to all of us. Then one afternoon, I opened my email and saw a forwarded message. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another family update. But when I clicked on the subject line that read "Final Itinerary," my breath caught. Florence, Rome, Amalfi. The document was filled with names my parents, Megan, Daniel, and their 2 kids. 6 names perfectly arranged, but not mine, not Grace, not Ethan. It was all laid out 5-star hotels, guided tours, private dinners, every detail planned, every cost already paid by me. I stared at the screen, waiting for my name to appear further down, maybe in a second wave of bookings, maybe as an oversight. But the silence that followed spoke louder than anything written there. And when Sunday dinner arrived, I carried that knowledge with me, unsure how long I could keep it in. Sunday dinner arrived like it always did. The smell of my mother's baked pasta filled the kitchen. The sound of my father's golf recap droned in the background, and Megan's laugh rang too loud over something trivial. Daniel sat scrolling his phone, barely pretending to listen. Grace twirled in her dress, while Ethan clung to my arm, both of them oblivious to the storm I carried inside. I had read the itinerary enough times to know it by heart, and the silence of their exclusion was still ringing in my ears. I placed the salad bowl in the center of the table, then lifted my wine glass. With what felt like casual ease, I said, "Italy must be beautiful this time of year, especially Florence." I sipped, slowly watching. The room seemed to pause just for a moment. My mother's hand stilled on the breadbasket. Megan blinked too many times in quick succession. Daniel's eyes darted to his water glass, as though it had suddenly become fascinating. Then my mother placed the basket down and looked at me across the table. Her voice was soft, almost gentle. "Next week is just special, Lauren. Bringing extra stress along wouldn't feel right. Extra stress." That was what she called my presence, what she called my children. My father leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, his voice steady and dismissive. "You've changed, Lauren. It's like you don't understand us anymore." Megan kept her eyes on her plate, chewing as if the food would dissolve the moment. No one spoke up. No one said they had meant to include me. No one offered the smallest apology for using my money to plan a dream without us. They sat in their practiced silence, and I realized they had prepared for this moment long before I walked through the door. I set my fork down gently, tapped it once against the side of my glass, and let the sound settle into the room. It was a tiny sound, yet it carried more weight than anything else that night. I smiled, not with bitterness, not with theatrics, just enough to acknowledge that I had heard every word, every omission. Dinner moved forward, the rhythm unchanged, though I could feel the air pulling tighter around us. The small talk resumed Megan's PTA updates, my father's latest golf score, Daniel's detached scrolling. Yet beneath the surface, something had already shifted. When the plates were cleared, I helped Grace into her coat, zipped Ethan's jacket, and thanked my mother for dinner. My words were polite, but they closed a door in their own way. The ride home was quiet, Grace humming a little tune she had picked up at school, Ethan chattering about a science project. They didn't sense the change, but I did. By the time I tucked them into bed and kissed their foreheads, I knew I would never again sit across from those faces and let them treat my children as if they didn't matter. That night, I sat at my desk, the itinerary glowing on my screen, the receipts neatly stacked beside me. Every booking, every charge, every confirmation sat under my name. They hadn't even bothered to disguise it. I stared at the details: flights, hotel suites, vineyard tours, boat cruises, each one a reminder of how easily they had erased me. But their arrogance had left a door wide open, and I realized that door was mine to close. I made tea and let the steam curl into the night air. The kids were asleep, the house quiet except for the low hum of the dishwasher. My hands moved across the keyboard without hurry, canceling one booking after another. The flights disappeared with a click. The hotels followed. The vineyard dinners, the private tours, the high-speed train tickets, all reversed, all refunded. I reset passwords, locked accounts, deactivated passes. It wasn't rage that drove me, not fire, but the calm precision of arithmetic. They had erased me, and now I would erase their trip. By the time I shut the laptop, it was past midnight. I poured the last of my tea and sat in the quiet, listening to the faint sound of rain against the window. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady anchored. They believed they had left me powerless, but the truth was laid out in every canceled booking and every confirmation email that no longer belonged to them. The next day passed without incident. Grace painted in the sunroom Ethan built towers of blocks, and I felt the kind of peace that comes only when you finally stop waiting for recognition. At 8 o'clock sharp, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel lit the screen. "Unblock the account now." His words were blunt, impatient. I stared at them, then typed back, "Sorry, I guess I'm just too different now." What followed was a cascade of messages. My mother's text came first. "Lauren, what did you do?" Megan sent a picture of her daughter crying, the caption, "Accusing me of cruelty." The kids were excited. They don't deserve this. But I thought of Grace and Ethan, of their laughter and curiosity, and I knew what they did not deserve was to be erased from a family album their grandmother and aunt had curated without them. That evening, as the clock struck 6, I pictured them at the airport. Designer luggage in hand, dressed in their coordinated travel outfits, standing at a gate with no seats reserved. I could almost hear my mother's voice snapping at the airline agent, my father pulling out a card that couldn't secure a group booking. Megan flustered Daniel, trying and failing to hold the appearance of calm. My phone buzzed again. "Why are we being denied boarding?" The words from Megan appeared on the screen, followed quickly by Daniel's frustrated question. "Did you cancel the flights?" I let the phone rest on the counter and turned back to the kitchen where Grace and Ethan were spreading too much cheese on homemade pizza. The smell of garlic and tomato filled the air, their laughter rising as dough stuck to their fingers. That was where I stayed in that kitchen, not answering, not explaining. I didn't need to. Silence was enough. 2 days later, a silver SUV sat parked in my parents' driveway. They had returned far earlier than planned, with no smiling photographs, no captions, no souvenirs of Florence or Rome. The doorbell rang that afternoon sharp against the quiet of my home. When I opened it, my mother stood there with her hair pulled back, face bare of makeup, wearing the same travel leggings she had probably boarded the plane in. Her expression was carefully composed, as if she had practiced a look of reasonableness in the mirror. "All right, you made your point," she said, her voice clipped but calm. Then she spoke of wedges driven through families, of how ruining a trip didn't heal exclusion. And almost in the same breath, she asked about the backyard project, reminding me that the contractor was booked for next month. She wondered if I could help with the deposit. I nearly smiled at the absurdity of it, the way she thought this could all be folded neatly back into the old rhythm. I told her I'd check my accounts and let her know by the end of the week. She left looking satisfied, unaware that the door she thought had reopened was no longer standing at all. What she didn't realize was that the shift had already happened. The moment had passed where I was the silent one at the table, waiting to be invited, waiting to be chosen. And as their plans unraveled, mine were only beginning. The night after my mother stood at my front door asking about deposits and backyard projects, I sat at the kitchen table long after the kids had gone to bed. The house was quiet. The only sound, the hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the old floorboards. My laptop glowed against the dim light, and with every login I opened, I felt the weight of what had been done. They had hidden nothing. My name was on every invoice, every reservation, every transfer. Their arrogance had left the paper trail wide open, and I had stepped straight into it. It wasn't anger that guided me. It was a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't racing. I wasn't pacing the room or raising my voice to an empty house. I sat with a mug of tea and a pen beside me, checking each booking as if it were part of a balance sheet. First the flights. I canceled them with a click, 3 first-class tickets gone, the refunds marked back to my account. Then the suites in Florence, both with rooftop access and spa packages. The reservations disappeared as easily as they had been made. The vineyard dinner, the Amalfi boat cruise, the rail passes between cities, all of it followed. My fingers moved steadily across the keys, reversing every charge. I logged into the travel portal I had set up months earlier, changed the password, locked out their email access, and deactivated the digital codes for tours and transfers. By the time I closed the lid of the laptop, it was nearly 3 a.m. The dishwasher clicked into its final cycle, the hum fading into silence. I turned off the kitchen light and climbed the stairs, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The next morning began like any other. Grace was at the table painting a school project while Ethan stacked blocks and knocked them over, his laughter bouncing off the walls. I made pancakes, the kind with too many chocolate chips, and let them eat at their own pace. Around 8 o'clock, my phone lit up on the counter. Daniel's message was short and sharp. "Unblock the account now." I stared at it for a moment before typing back, "Sorry, I guess I'm just too different now." The words carried none of the weight of argument, just a mirror of what my parents had said at dinner days earlier. Then the messages poured in. Patricia's text came first. "Lauren, what have you done?" Megan followed with a photo of her daughter crying. The caption accusing me of cruelty. The kids were excited. They don't deserve this. Charles didn't text at all. He called instead, but I let it ring into silence. They had chosen to erase my children, and now they were forced to explain to their own why the trip had vanished. I knew their departure time down to the minute. At 6:10 that evening, their flight should have left Los Angeles bound for Rome. At 6:12, another message appeared from Megan. "Why are we being denied boarding?" A second followed, then a third. "Did you cancel the flights?" I put the phone down and turned back to the kitchen where Grace and Ethan stood side by side kneading pizza dough. Cheese clung to Ethan's fingers, and Grace giggled as flour dusted the counter. That was where my attention stayed on them, on the warmth of the kitchen, not on the chaos unraveling miles away at an airport gate. By Sunday afternoon, their SUV was back in the driveway, parked like a monument to defeat. 2 days after they should have been walking cobblestone streets, they returned with no photos, no captions, no stories. Just silence. At 3:47, the doorbell rang. Patricia stood on the porch with her hair tied back and no makeup, dressed in travel clothes that looked worn from long hours. She didn't ask to come inside. She said only, "All right, you made your point." Then came a lecture about how ruining trips drives wedges into families, how exclusion wasn't fixed by revenge. And then, almost seamlessly, she asked about the backyard again, wondering if I would be able to cover the deposit so they wouldn't lose their place with the contractor. I told her I'd check my accounts and let her know by the end of the week. She left with a faint smile, as though she believed the door between us could still swing open again. What she didn't realize was that it wasn't simply closed. It was gone. The following days carried a different rhythm. Megan sent a text that read more like a coworker's email than a sister's message. "Hey, Mom said you might be covering the backyard. Let us know so we can confirm." I waited hours before responding. Still checking a few things. "I'll confirm soon." Soon became Friday, then Saturday, then nothing at all. By Monday, Charles tried his hand at a softer tone. I watched his name flash on the screen, ignored the call, and read his follow-up text. "We're not trying to pressure you, just need to know what's happening so we can plan." I typed back, "Totally understand. Should have an answer soon." It was polite, direct, and empty, exactly the kind of words they had spoken to me for years. For the first time, the balance shifted. The people who had once treated me as disposable were now waiting for me. The ones who excluded my children were now asking for help with lawn projects and gravel deliveries, and each time I delayed, each time I mirrored their tone, the silence grew heavier between us. Thanksgiving crept closer. In years past, Patricia would have sent a group text about who was bringing what dish. Megan would have followed with a reminder to RSVP. That year, nothing came. No invitation, no mention, not even a passive reminder. On the night before the holiday, I scrolled past Megan's post. A table set for 10 each place card, handwritten napkins folded into swans. The caption read, "Grateful for the real ones." Grace and Ethan's names weren't there. Mine wasn't either. It was not a mistake. It was a deliberate erasing, complete and clean. At our house, the three of us made waffles because Grace had insisted, and mac and cheese because Ethan wanted it. We sat on the couch with plates in our laps, messy and warm, watching old Christmas movies. Their laughter filled the room, and for the first time the absence of my family did not echo in the walls. Days later in the grocery store parking lot, a neighbor named Linda gave me a sheepish smile and asked, "They didn't invite you, did they?" I shook my head. "First time," she said quietly. "Megan told your grandmother it was just simpler this way." Simpler, that was the word they used. Not painful, not cruel, just simpler, like erasing us from their table was a matter of convenience. And as Christmas approached, I didn't even check my phone for an invitation. Instead, another neighbor sent me a photo from Megan's page. Matching pajamas, stockings hung above the fireplace, hot cocoa, and smiles. 5 stockings, none with our names. I studied the picture in silence. No Grace, no Ethan, not even my name tucked at the edge out of courtesy. And for the first time, the realization didn't break me. It clarified everything. They weren't only excluding us anymore, they were removing us step by step until we no longer existed in their idea of family. I closed the photo and whispered into the quiet house. Then we'll see how it feels when the silence goes both ways. Christmas passed quietly in our house. Grace and Ethan opened their presents in the glow of the tree lights, and the 3 of us spent the day building puzzles and baking cookies. I didn't check my phone, but a neighbor later sent me a screenshot of Megan's holiday post. Matching pajamas, stockings hung neatly over the fireplace, steaming mugs of cocoa in their hands. There were only 5 stockings, not 7. My children's names weren't there. Mine wasn't either. I looked at that photo for a long time. The omission no longer came as a surprise, but something inside me shifted. They weren't just leaving us out of gatherings anymore, they were writing us out altogether. And in the quiet of my living room with Ethan curled on the rug and Grace laughing at a silly Christmas movie, I knew the silence between my family and me was no longer mine to break. Weeks later, an envelope appeared in the mail with my name written in my mother's handwriting. Inside was a folded note and a check. She had written 2 short paragraphs, one saying they hoped to repair what was left, the other enclosing my share of the Italy trip since I hadn't gone. The check was for $3,600. I held it in my hand and laughed quietly. It wasn't the number that struck me, it was the assumption that the wound they had carved out could be patched over with a reimbursement. I pinned the check to the fridge with a magnet right beside Grace's glittery New Year's card. 3 days later, Megan texted, "Grandma's in the hospital. She's been asking for you." For a moment, I froze. My grandmother Margaret lived alone up in Sacramento and had stayed out of the family conflicts. She was the only one who never forgot birthdays, who always sent cards without being reminded. I called the hospital and confirmed. It wasn't life-threatening, just a mild heart issue, but she had asked for me twice. That same evening, I packed a bag and drove north. When I walked into her room, she was propped up against pillows, her silver hair brushed neatly back. She looked at me with tired but steady eyes and smiled. "Lauren," she said softly, "you okay, honey?" I pulled a chair closer, and for the first time since everything began, I told someone the truth from start to finish. I spoke of the trip, the money, the itinerary with our names missing the dinner, where I was told my presence would ruin things. I explained how they had returned home and still asked for help with deposits, how they erased us from holidays as though we had never existed. She listened without interrupting, her hands resting gently on the blanket. When I finished, she closed her eyes, drew a long breath, and whispered, "That's not what they told me." My chest tightened. What did they say? She opened her eyes again, sadness clouding them. "They told me you refused to go, that you got angry and canceled everything out of spite." I shook my head slowly. "That's not even close to the truth." She reached out and touched my hand. "I'm so sorry, Lauren. I don't know what's wrong with them." Her voice cracked a little, but her words steadied me more than I expected. For once, someone outside my own home understood. Someone believed me. The fallout came faster than I imagined. Less than an hour after I left the hospital, my phone buzzed. Patricia's message. "Did you twist things for Grandma?" Then Megan. "She doesn't need this stress, Lauren. She's old." Daniel followed with, "You're turning people against their own family. This is toxic." I didn't reply. I didn't have to. Their anger wasn't about what I had said. It was about the fact that someone had finally heard my side and believed it. The next day, a group text came from Patricia, including Charles, Megan, and Daniel. Effective immediately, we'd like to move forward with more transparency and unity. We're hoping you'll be part of future plans. Let's reconnect soon. There was no apology, no admission of what had been done, just a new angle, a repositioning, as if changing the label could change the story. Megan texted separately the day after. "Hey, I've been thinking, maybe we could meet up for coffee next week. Just talk, no pressure." The heart emoji blinked back at me from the screen. The same woman who had erased my daughter's name from a Christmas stocking was now asking for a latte and conversation. I agreed, setting a time for Tuesday morning. At 9:41 that day, I sent her a quick message. "Sorry, last-minute work meeting. Can we reschedule?" She replied within minutes. "Totally understand. Let's touch base later this week." 2 days later, Patricia messaged me again. "Would you be able to help cover gravel delivery?" "Just $300 to cover the shortfall," I wrote back. "Let me check some things. I'll circle back." Saturday came and went with no word from me. On Monday, Charles texted about firewood. He said the supplier had raised prices and asked if I could help. I replied, "Send me the link. I'll look into it." He sent it. I didn't respond. Each message they sent, I answered with the same tone they had used on me for years. Polite but empty, kind but non-committal. They were words that promised without delivering, words that sounded like connection but carried no warmth. I became them, and it worked. Megan went quiet first, her cheerful emojis disappearing. Patricia's messages grew shorter, then fewer. Daniel unfollowed me on social media. Even Charles skipped the annual birthday group text he never used to miss. For the first time, they were on the outside waiting for replies that never came. The holidays had passed, the trip was gone, the money was no longer available, and I was no longer the bank or the fallback. I was something they hadn't planned for independent. February arrived with a strange quiet. The family group thread that once buzzed with reminders and photos had gone dark. There were no birthday messages, no updates about my parents' house, no check-ins disguised as requests. Weeks slipped by without a word, but it wasn't silence I dreaded anymore. It was the relief that came with it. Then one morning another envelope appeared in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just my name in my mother's wavering handwriting. Inside was the same check I had pinned to my fridge weeks earlier, folded back into the original envelope. A short note was tucked beside it. "We're hoping to reset. Your father and I are thinking of selling the house. The proceeds might go into a shared family account for future needs. We'd like you to be part of that vision." I held the note at my kitchen counter, reading it twice. The words weren't about reconciliation. They were about positioning. A shared account, a family vision, an appeal to something bigger than the brokenness between us. I didn't respond. 2 days later, my phone lit up with Megan's name. For the first time in months, she was calling, not texting. Her voicemail played in a bright, rehearsed tone. "Hey, Lauren, it's been too long. The kids really miss Grace and Ethan. I've been thinking about what you said before, and maybe it's time for a real reset. Mom and Dad are serious about selling the house, and we thought the money could help build something future-focused for all of us. I'd love to hear your input and your help setting it up." I let the message finish before setting the phone down. It wasn't the first time Megan had shifted into warmth when there was something on the line, but it was the first time I realized how easily she could switch her tone. The next morning, I sealed the check back in the envelope and dropped it into the mailbox on my way to work. No note, no explanation, just the same silence they had once used on me. Weeks passed without a response. No messages on the group thread, no new invitations. I heard from a neighbor that the house had sold, and my parents had moved to a smaller place outside the city. There was no announcement, no farewell dinner, no request for me to stop by. Just a quiet relocation, as if the walls of that house had held too many echoes of what had been said. At home, the days took on a different rhythm. Grace started practicing piano with more confidence, her small fingers finding the keys to old songs. Ethan spent afternoons drawing superheroes on scrap paper, narrating their battles with his own sound effects. In the evenings, I sat with them at the table dinners, simple and steady. There was no performance, no expectation, just us. One afternoon, Grace came into the kitchen with a question. "Mom, are we going to Grandma and Grandpa's new house for Easter?" Her voice was light, curious. I shook my head gently. "No, honey, not this year." She nodded, accepted it, and went back to her drawings. The moment passed easily for her, but I carried the weight of knowing she understood more than she let on. Spring arrived, and with it a sense of release. The silence from my parents and Megan was no longer heavy. It was freeing. They had made their choice, and I had made mine. The house was gone, the check was gone, and the ties that once bound me to their table were loosening thread by thread. But beneath that quiet, I knew something else was coming. People who spend years pulling strings don't stop when one line snaps. They find another way. By early spring, the distance between us felt final. The check had been returned, the house had been sold, and no one in my family had said a word since. I assumed the silence would continue, but one afternoon my phone buzzed with a new message. It was Megan. "We should catch up soon, maybe next week." Her words were cheerful, but the timing left no doubt something had shifted. I didn't answer right away. Hours later, Patricia called. I let it go to voicemail, then listened as her voice filled the quiet of my kitchen. "Lauren, your father and I have been talking. We don't want the past to define everything. The house is sold, yes, but we'd like you to be involved in what comes next. Think of it as a chance to build something future-focused. We'd love to include you." The message sat on my phone like a puzzle. They weren't reaching out to apologize. They weren't acknowledging the pain of exclusion or the weight of what they had done. They were repositioning again, wrapping control in new language. A day later, Megan sent another text. "Coffee this week. Just us. I'll buy." I agreed to Tuesday morning, but at 9:41 I typed out a quick message. "Sorry, last-minute meeting. Can we reschedule?" She responded within seconds. "Totally understand. Let's touch base later." There was no later. That Friday, Charles called with a different tone than usual. "We're not trying to pressure you." His voicemail began. "We just want to know what's happening so we can plan." His voice was soft, almost kind, but it carried the same intent as before. I replied with a text. "Totally get it. Should have an answer soon." Each request that followed, I met with the same politeness they had used on me for years. When Patricia asked if I could cover $300 for gravel delivery, I said, "Let me check some things. I'll circle back." When Daniel texted about a shortfall for firewood, I replied, "Send me the link. I'll look into it." I never followed through. For the first time, they were the ones waiting. They had defined me as the fallback, the reliable one, the steady hand who would fix whatever they couldn't. Now I gave them nothing but stillness. Their responses grew shorter, then scattered, then vanished. Megan went quiet first. The cheerful emojis disappeared, replaced by silence. Patricia's messages dwindled, her words clipped and cautious. Daniel unfollowed me on social media, erasing the digital presence he once filled with requests and reminders. Even Charles broke his own rhythm. For the first time in 10 years, the birthday group message never came. At home, I noticed the difference in small ways. Grace no longer asked if her grandparents were coming over. Ethan didn't mention holidays with cousins. Our evenings were full of board games, bedtime stories, and the ordinary noise of our own lives. The air felt clearer, the weight lifted. Then another envelope arrived in March. No return address, just my mother's handwriting on the front. Inside was a folded note. "We're hoping to reset. Your father and I are serious about building something future-focused for the family. We'd like you to be a part of that vision." The same phrases, again polished and deliberate. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement, just positioning. I sealed the note back into the envelope, placed it on the counter, and left it there. Days passed without me touching it again. This time, I didn't feel the need to reply. Their silence had once felt like a verdict. Now mine was a boundary. As March faded into April, I knew another turn was coming. People who had spent years relying on me weren't likely to stop searching for ways back in. They would find another angle, another appeal, another word dressed as invitation. The question was no longer what they would do. It was how I would answer. By the time April settled in, the silence felt complete. My phone no longer lit up with polite requests or rehearsed invitations. For weeks there was nothing until a new envelope appeared at the end of my driveway. It was small, unmarked, and carried my mother's handwriting across the front. Inside was the same check again, folded once more. This time, a note was attached. "Your father and I are hoping to reset. We're considering new ways to provide for the family, and we'd love you to be part of the plan." The words were polished, steady, but empty. They never once spoke of what had been done. I didn't answer. 2 days later, Megan called, her voice carefully bright. "The kids miss Grace and Ethan," she said. "I've been thinking about what you told me before, and maybe it's really time for a reset. Mom and Dad are serious about selling the house and setting up something future-focused for all of us. We'd love your input and your help setting it up." I listened to the message twice, then set the phone face down. Their tone had shifted, but the pattern hadn't changed. They weren't reaching for me, they were reaching for what I could give. The following week, Patricia left another message. "Would you be able to pitch in for gravel delivery? It's just $300 to cover the shortfall." Her words were clipped as if trimmed down to sound reasonable. I replied the same way I always had. "Let me check my accounts. I'll circle back." But I never did. Charles followed days later with a text about firewood. He explained the supplier had raised prices, asked if I could step in. I told him to send me the link. He did, and I left it unopened. It went on like that for weeks. Each time they reached, I responded with the same measured tone they had once used on me. Polite, delayed, promising without delivering. It was the language of distance, a language I had spent years receiving. Now I spoke it fluently. Slowly, they fell away. Megan's texts thinned, the cheerful emojis gone. Patricia's messages grew shorter, then stopped. Daniel disappeared entirely from my phone, erasing the digital trail he had once filled with reminders and demands. Even Charles broke the rhythm that had lasted a decade. For the first time in 10 years, his birthday group text never came. For them, the silence was new. For me, it was steady ground. Grace and Ethan filled the house with their laughter and projects. We cooked dinners, played games, and lived our days without waiting for a call or an invitation. The absence was no longer painful. It was clean. In late spring, another envelope arrived again with no return address. Inside was the same folded check and a message written in my mother's wavering script. "Your father and I are moving forward with selling the house. We want this to be about family legacy. Please be part of the vision." I slid the note back into the envelope and sealed it again. The next morning, I dropped it in the mailbox without a word. I didn't call, didn't text, didn't explain. It wasn't rejection. It was closure. Weeks passed. The group thread stayed silent. No memes, no reminders, no invitations. Birthdays slipped by without notice. The house was sold, and word of their move came through a neighbor, not from them. They were gone, tucked into a smaller home outside the city, and I had never been invited. For the first time, I didn't want to be. That spring, I took Grace and Ethan on a road trip up the coast. We stopped in Monterey, collected sea glass along the shore, and stayed in a tiny bed and breakfast where the floors creaked and the biscuits came warm from the oven. There were no staged photos, no coordinated outfits, just us laughing, wandering, and letting the days unfold as they came. At night, Grace would fall asleep with a book resting on her chest, and Ethan would whisper stories about the superheroes he drew during the day. I would sit by the window and listen to the ocean outside, realizing that these small, quiet moments held more joy than any trip my parents had ever planned. They had erased us from their table, but in doing so, they gave me the space to build my own. Looking back, I could see how much of my life had been spent waiting for their approval, waiting for an invitation, waiting to be acknowledged. That waiting had shaped me more than I cared to admit, but standing on the edge of the water with my children's hands in mine, I understood that belonging doesn't come from someone else's permission. It comes from the life you choose to build. My parents and Megan still live in their smaller house outside the city. We haven't spoken in months. There are no more envelopes, no more messages dressed as invitations. Maybe one day that silence will break, but I don't need it to. My children and I have found our own rhythm, one that feels whole without their voices. If there's anything this journey has taught me, it's that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's the final word. Justice doesn't always arrive with a loud declaration. It can arrive quietly in the peace of your own home, in the laughter of your children, in the life you build, when you stop asking to be included. And maybe that's what resilience really looks like, not in fighting to stay at a table that doesn't want you, but in building one where you and the people you love always have a seat. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever had to find your own way forward, I'd love to hear it. Share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure you subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this one.